Well, each year we ask for your questions for the At Issue panel. That's the easy part. The hard part is deciding which to use on air. So thanks to all who sent ideas along. Know that we read every one. Andrew and Chantel and Rex are here, and so is Jennifer Ditchburn of Canadian Press. Let's get to the very first one. Chantel, why don't you start us off? Here it comes from Eric Wolf Rabinowitz. Do you think the fixed date election extended the life of the 41st Parliament? Could the Conservatives have won another mandate if the election had come sooner? And is there any sentiment to return to the previous system for calling federal elections?
Three questions.
Yes. One answer, though.
Yes, I think it extended the life of the 41st Parliament. Probably Stephen Harper would have liked to go earlier rather than later. Spare himself the Duffy trial, amongst other things, go right after the budget. I don't know that they would have won the election, and I am not convinced that it was just a matter of timing and that they would have won in April and lost in October. And I hope we stick to the fixed date elections because it actually allowed for more of a policy debate and less of a gotcha campaign than we have had in the past when the Prime Minister waited for the day when his opponents felt sick to call an election because that's where his advantage was.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who complain, oh, we were talking about the election for all this time. I would just remind those people, before we had the fixed election date, what we instead talked about for months on end is when's the election going to be?
Yes.
So we at least took that out of the, right. I mean, I'd rather have, as Chantel said, we had a nice long discussion in the spring about Liberal tax policy, NDP childcare policy.
Mm-hmm. Would it change one thing, though? Every election is unique, and it's unique because of the time in which it takes place.
Yes.
So we have no idea whether the Liberals, the NDP, or the Conservatives would have won. But having nailed them to a mast, they don't get the leverage of picking their time.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Jennifer, you start us. Trevor Amon writes, Prime Minister Trudeau has promised that the 2015 federal election will be the last first-past-the-post election in Canada. There are several possible alternatives to first-past-the-post, but regardless of the actual electoral reform Trudeau brings in, do you see a way for the Conservative Party to ever form a majority government again if they are incapable of attracting more than 40% of the popular vote and the majority of their electors have no second choice?
Yes, I mean, the Conservatives have done it before. Brian Mulroney had well over 40% of the popular vote. They're just going to have to abandon this idea or the strategy of getting the minimum voting coalition that they need. They're going to have to broaden the tent, and I'm already hearing Ron Ambrose talk about that. Reach out to more progressive Conservatives, move a little bit more to the centre, and stop playing so many wedge politics. I think it's clear that if the electoral system changes, that's what they're going to have to do.
All of which Mulroney did.
Yes.
In 84 and 88.
But everybody will have to change their strategy. If you change the electoral system, everybody's going to be affected by it. For example, if you go to a proportional representation, that probably means the Greens win more seats. So the NDP is going to have to adjust to that. Nobody will be able to base their campaign just on let's win Ontario or Quebec. They're going to have a national campaign, these kinds of things. So, yeah, it means the Conservatives are going to have to adjust, but so will everybody.
Yeah, I think Andrew's point is the key one. I was thinking about the NDP. The NDP at one point had a couple of weeks there where they might form a government, but now that they're back to third place, if you switch the system, the NDP really, they have no second choice. They're the ones that really have got to do some work here. So change the system, every party has to change.
All right. Ria Kamen writes this. What policy or legacy of the Harper government do you think will be the greatest challenge in 2016 for the Liberal government? Jennifer.
I like this question because I'm co-editing a book on this very subject. Yes.
You got a plug for the book
yes,
as well.
There you go.
That's good.
I think there's so many things that you could say, but I think it was the cut of 2 points off the GST because it's hamstrung future governments. Think about the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, said that for every point of the GST that you lost, in 2013, that represented $7 billion annually. So imagine what those 2 points are today in today's numbers. Think of what you could do with all that money for infrastructure, for moving towards a more sustainable economy. All these things that they want to do, they've just got less wiggle room because of that change that the Conservatives brought in.
I'd suggest to you is to change, it's a tone thing, the change of control from the PMO, from the Prime Minister's own office, that coupled with transparency. The hardest commitment that any opposition party has to keep is that when it's in opposition, it's idealistic and everything is perfect, and they can promise that we will not have a dictatorial regime and we'll be transparent beyond the dreams of everybody. Remember Sheila Copps and the GST. Now that they're in, Now that they're there, this idea that suddenly aides and staff and bureaucrats are going to be open and free and easy, that's the hard one to keep, and the hypocrisy will be noted.
Can I just say on Jennifer's point, I disagree somewhat. If they'd kept spending, the Conservatives kept spending where they found it in 2006, which is after the Liberals had run it up enormously. If they'd kept it, even adjusting for inflation and population growth, instead of, as they happened to do, they ramped it up even in advance of the financial crisis, then ramped it up $50 billion in 1 year. People talk about the austerity in the last few years. It was only from these all-time record levels of spending. If they had kept spending under control, even with the cuts in the GST, the fiscal situation would be fine.
Still, choices were made that are difficult to unmake. I'll just take one example, childcare. A lot of parents in many Canadian cities are crying for more childcare. But once you go down the road of sending family allowance checks every month, you have taken the money you could have used to structurally make that choice, and you've done something else with it. And it's very difficult to come back from that.
All right. Andrew, start us off on this one. It comes from Betty Walton. Is it possible that for every Syrian refugee we bring in, we equally help an Indigenous Canadian? Now, I don't expect you to answer that. You're not a government minister. I put it on the table, at least as a discussion point, because of all the questions we got, many were along this very same theme.
Yeah, and I mean, the temptation to say is not an either or, but of course it is either or. Everything is a choice in government. I think this is an honorable choice when you've got people facing this degree of suffering. It seems to me that's how you measure society, is how you treat the people who are worst off. And yes, people who are worst off in our society should be at the top of our priority list as well. But this is one of the great humanitarian crises of our time. And even if we're only going to be able to do one small part of it, 25,000 is only a small part of the millions of people who are on the move, I think it's an honorable choice for a government to make.
And this government seems to be signaling that they're working on the other issue as well.
But I don't think it's an either-or issue. We should address the Aboriginal issue, and we should do what the heavy lifting involved to make a change there. But when you bring in the Syrian refugees, or when you brought in the boat people, you actually brought people to this country, as we bring immigrants every year that are part and parcel of the economic strategy of this country in any event. So I think you can do both, but I don't think you can say for each Syrian refugee that we're bringing in, we are leaving someone in the lurch, an Aboriginal Canadian, or vice versa. I can't see that.
I think what you're seeing is that this feeling that, wow, look what we can do. There's this collective outpouring of energy behind a single issue. And so I think it's almost natural to say, what else could we do if we all put our shoulder behind the wheel and work together? Maybe that's where that comes from.
Two very brief points. You should not make charity or the humanitarian impulse contingent on something else. If someone is suffering and dying, you don't set up an equation. Secondly, as between the Syrian refugee and the indigenous population, the latter is our duty, and the first is our election.
All right. Andrew. Bill Major writes this question. What can be done to make our political life less partisan? How can we make politicians throw away their message scripts and become real people working together on the real problems we face as Canadians? Never heard Andrew talk about this point before.
Neither have I.
Well, I'm not sure you can, would be the short answer. I mean, let's be realistic. There are going to be partisans, but you can lessen the absurd degree that we've taken it. And I think there's two broad areas in that. One is if you have less control from the top down of each party, then you're giving people more freedom to behave like normal individuals, i.e. using their own brains and not just parroting the party line all day long. And secondly, if you have more room for more parties. We have a kind of a cartel right now of 2 or 3 large parties that are kind of controlling the territory, and it's very hard for new parties to break in because of the electoral system. If you change the electoral system, then you get a chance for newer parties to come in and shake things up a bit, and I think that makes it harder for people just to behave like automatons as well.
Correct?
I'd reverse the process, although I can see you. I think that if you get elected to the House of Commons for any party, that means, at least in the current system, that you've won the confidence or the respect of a fairly large pool of people. Keep your damn courage when you get in there. I've seen many candidates before they got elected, and they're, almost tribunes of the people. And as soon as they fall into the system, it's not the discipline, it's the lack of courage in the case of so many of them. That's a very big one. The second one is just very shortly. They should outlaw, that's practical, they should outlaw talking points. The idea of a piece of wood saying the same thing over and over again is not attractive. And that's what many members of Parliament turn into.
Did you want to?
I just want to say that to be partisan is not to disagree. And the reason why Parliament works when it works best is because people with different perspectives are willing to put them forward. That goes to the courage issue. But courage is not to always say white because the other side said black. And that's where the line gets crossed. But to have different ideas and to defend them, I think, is healthy. And people say that's partisan because they're not kind of going at each other. But that is a healthy part of the system.
All right. This is an interesting question here. I'm not sure I agree with the preamble. I know the panel probably dislikes Trump, that's the preamble, but everyone I talk to agrees with most of what Trump has to say. Why do you think there is such a disconnect between the political elite and the media and everyone else? And I guess that's the heart of the question, whether or not you agree with that or not. Jennifer, what do you make
Must
of
be
that?
talking to the different people because I haven't met any Canadian that likes Trump. But anyway, that being said, I wonder if it's more not what Trump is saying, but how he's saying it that attracts people. And by that I mean that he's unapologetic. He says what's on his mind. He's not saying sorry all the time for expressing his views. And I know this sounds strange, but I think sometimes about Jean Chrétien, and Jean Chrétien never apologized. He was who he was. Do you remember when with the pepper spray and the protesters, and someone asked him about it? He said, "Oh, I put pepper on my plate." I mean, this is the same guy who put someone in a neck lock. He was who he was, and he never said sorry for what he had said. And I think that's the element of Donald Trump, that he's out there and he's authentic.
I'd go to a different analogy, and I am serious too, believe it or not. We saw the example of Mayor Ford in this country. And despite all of his personal propensities, some of which outraged some people, there was still a strong and a genuine response. And there was two reasons for that. Mr. Ford was more a message than he was the substantial figure. It was the discontent with the talking points, with the stale politics, with the cynicism. Down in the States, Trump is a much bigger phenomenon. Partly what you say is true, but the bigger thing is this. It is a disgust almost at the conventional machinery of politics, and secondly, it is a rabid protest against the language of political correctness. Those are two things.
But let's remember, he's getting a fraction of the vote of one party. So this is not representative of the broad mass of the public versus these out-of-touch
Bernie
media.
Sanders would play it to the other side. I'd use him as a counterexample.
No, fair enough. But the question was kind of framed, as it often is in these discussions, that it's the public at large out there, and then there's this out-of-touch media elite that just doesn't get it. As with Ford, there's a version of Rob Ford, there's a version of Donald Trump that could be kind of attractive, and that's what some of their supporters think of him as. Yeah, he's the plain-spoken guy who tells it like it is, and maybe the politically correct don't like it. And that kind of candidate, fine, I could get behind. That's not who either of these people are. It's not that they're politically incorrect. It's that they say things that are just factually incorrect. They say things that are just completely inflammatory and wrong.
There's
nothing particularly valuable to contribute.
There's a point of challenge. Neither Trump nor Sanders could be at 2% if the respect for the institutions of politics and to a degree the media hasn't been as low as it has been.
Last time I looked at the schoolyard bully always has friends. So to the point that it's to be natural, I'm myself, and I don't feel like putting your neck in a handlock.
You were different half an hour ago.
Oh, good. In the makeup room.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Spirited, absolute little discussion. I would just add one point to what you were saying in terms of the fraction of support that he has. When he goes up against Hillary Clinton, it's a close race.
Maybe.
Oh, I don't see it
at
all.
least in the polls, in the
mean,
national polls.
It's very hard to win an election in the United States without Latino voters, and I don't see how he's going to square that
I didn't say he'd
circle.
win. I'm just saying that fraction is a significant fraction, even in a one-off against a
Yeah,
Democrat.
but you're doing it on polls. Polls tell you people don't want in Canada women to be wearing kneecaps, that Quebecers love the Quebec Charter,
Right.
etc. Look where all those people are today.
Why are you jumping on me? He was the one who started with the fraction of support by polls. He was giving a counter. That's all right. We've got to take a quick break. But when we come back, more of your questions. And welcome back to your questions for At Issue. Andrew, Chantel, Rex, and Jennifer are all still right here and ready for this one from Jason Baines, who wrote to us on Facebook. Here it is. With the election and/or growth in radical socialist and anti-austerity parties pretty much everywhere in the world, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Germany, and the prominence of socialists such as Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, what prospect is there for the NDP to move in a more left-wing and socialist direction? Chantal.
It's going to be really hard for the NDP within the Canadian framework to move to the left of the current Liberals, frankly. And two, it's impossible to take those examples and apply them to Canada's political environment. There are other examples. Some of the people in that list are actually not in power and not within sight of it. I'm thinking of Labour in Great Britain, to name just one example.
Jennifer.
It's going to depend on a lot on what Thomas Mulcair does, because he's not going to be the one that moves the party to the left. And I'm fairly certain there will be people in the party who say this is why we lost the election and we need someone who's going to move us that way. But it's all going to depend on the leadership there.
Rex.
The strength of the Liberal campaign, aside from the rancor directed towards Harper per se, was that essentially they took the sentiment and tone of the NDP and some of their policies, but they became, I'm agreeing with Chantal, no more headlocks, that they took away the image of the NDP as the progressive, the warm, the open. So they can't move any further because Trudeau has already occupied the ground.
No room to the left?
No, not in this, again, not in this context at all.
Andrew.
I think we have to separate, what they should do between and what is necessarily the winning strategy. We tend to speak of those as being the same thing. But my view is they should be whoever they actually authentically are. They should say the things they actually believe. Certainly, the opposite strategy of trying to pretend they were a centrist party didn't pay off for them politically, but also I think it just robbed them of their soul. So I think, what are you in politics for if you're not there to represent what you honestly believe? You're providing a service to the public by offering people a diversity of viewpoints. And maybe in the course of it, over the long run, you will have some electoral success. But even if you don't, you'll change the debate. The NDP has had an enormous impact over the years in Canadian politics without ever being elected to anything federally. So, I would counsel that.
All right. Well, thank you for your answers, but most of all, thank you for your questions. We really appreciate them. From all of us here, have a great holiday season.